Welcome to my YouTube channel. This is Startup Art Therapy to Rewire Your Brain, and I'm Carrie McCarthy, registered art therapist and licensed professional clinical counselor with 23 years of experience. And on this channel, we talk about all things trauma and how to resolve trauma. And today we are talking about Minority Mental Health Month. This is the month of July, and there are national days of commemoration, months of commemoration of many different types of things, National Ice Cream Day, or Native American Heritage Month, or all of these things that can happen in all the different months. But one of the things that July is known for is National Minority Mental Health Month. So I am here in South Dakota. You might see that my background is a little different. I'm staying at a friend's house, and I am giving a training last week. I'm here helping the Pine Ridge Reservation tribal schools on how to become trauma-informed classrooms. And they are working through a SAMHSA grant called Project Aware. And I've given 5 trainings to them last summer, working with Native American children. So we empower the therapists and the teachers in the tribal schools to facilitate our year-long classroom curriculum, making their classrooms trauma-informed and also helping them to become trauma-informed professionals. So I just provided a 2-day training where we did 5 modules in the Startup Art Therapy Whole Brain Healing System. And one of the, I always learn so much from all of the different tribes that I work with in the US and Canada. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is the cultural and historical trauma reactions in cultural and historical trauma. So one of the things that and this is regarding especially Native Americans, but this can be in any culture that has historical trauma. And what historical trauma is the cumulative trauma that has impacted the genetic markers in the DNA that is passed down through successive generations. And there's enough research now that shows that grandchildren and offspring of people who had once suffered some sort of trauma, repetitive trauma, such as war or chemical exposure, can actually build not only a fear response of these things that they weren't directly exposed to as grandchildren of these people who originally suffered the original trauma, but they can actually develop sensitivities, physical sensitivities to certain things that their grandparents were exposed to. And this has been proven through research in lab mice, Holocaust survivors and their offspring, as well as World War II veterans and their offspring. So, and these are the things that I teach about in the epigenetics research in a module that I teach in the Startup Art Therapy Whole Brain Healing System, because knowledge is power. So one of the things I'm going to be talking about here today is the impacts of historical trauma on a culture in regards to Native Americans, because I've been working with the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people for 20 years. And I've lived on reservations. I was married to a Lakota man and into the family. And I still have very deep connections and roots ingratiated into the communities here in South Dakota, Great Plains region with the Native people. So I'm just going to read off a few of the things that can happen in historical trauma and the long-term impacts it has on a culture and racial, ethnic group of people. So people can, namely Native Americans, they can experience higher rates of mental and physical illness, and we see a huge disproportionate rate of depression, anxiety, PTSD symptoms, anger, dissociation, and ADD, ADHD, fetal alcohol syndrome, and how that intergenerational trauma keeps playing out with each generation. And one of my statistics in my training is that 47% of children have been found to have anxiety or depression in the global population. But what they're actually finding in Native American population is that number is way higher, almost 100% of children. So that's something that can be bled down through the genes and expressed outwardly, or it can also be caused by intergenerational trauma, because when there are intergenerational trauma, there's that cycle. And when children who are abused physically, sexually, neglected and abandoned in childhood, they can turn to drugs and alcohol to self-medicate. They can commit suicide. But when they survive all of that, they can become adults and parents that continue domestic violence, substance abuse, and child abuse, and with their own offspring. And so that cycle just keeps repeating itself. And that's how intergenerational trauma can work, not just in Native Americans, but really in any culture and any family system that's stuck in that loop. So depression and fixation on the trauma, and I understand why people would be fixated on that, but we have to provide solutions. And again, we have to neurobiologically correct the brain in neurorehabilitation from the trauma and get them off the trauma loop. It can create low self-esteem, which can perpetuate these stereotypes and the internalized oppression. I'm just a dirty Indian. There's no future for me. Nobody's going to hire me because of the discrimination and racism that happens. So they just give up, right? That's called futurelessness. Self-destructive behavior. The pain of all of the trauma and the hurt can be so great that somebody introduces them to drugs and alcohol, and it's a great way to numb out and dissociate from the pain, or bringing themselves back into their bodies from the dissociative state. And especially when there's avoidance and numbing, kids, that's when they start cutting themselves or burning themselves so they can feel something physically, because they tend to dissociate. So substance abuse, domestic violence, because that aggression, that's part of the fight, flight, or freeze. So the fight is the aggression, and the brain can be in that hyperarousal state from the original traumas, that it's sending out that fight response. And that's not just in males, though it tends to be in males, but it can also be in females. Suicide epidemics are prevalent in reservations across the country. And we are actually, next week, I'm going to meet with some cabinet members of Secretary of the Department of Interior, Deb Haaland, and we are going to devise an initiative that brings my startup art therapy whole brain healing system classroom curriculum, and help the top federal, state, and Native run organizations, help them to understand the importance that this is actually providing a solution to a long-standing problem due to genocide and colonization here in the US historically, and how we can actually help the children and adults rebuild one classroom at a time, and working with the Bureau of Indian Education. So this is the solution we have to be able to mitigate historical trauma reactions. So another thing that can happen is compromised physical health due to access of, or compromised access of care, lack of access to healthy food, and subpar healthcare. I worked with Indian Health Services at the federal government level, and the doctors are very unqualified for the most part, and they were hiring doctors that either, lost their license or were not really astute professionals and couldn't get hired elsewhere. So, or abusers. So there's, and they don't have a lot of access to healthcare. And that's a whole nother conversation we can have. But the long-term impacts of historical trauma can lead to erosion in families and community structures. Historical trauma is cumulative and can reverberate across generations. So Startup Art Therapy's aim is to go in and disrupt that trauma loop, give adaptive coping skills, identity formation, cultural identity, and help optimize the brain, building the nervous system so children can actually have access to that prefrontal cortex that's responsible for the executive functioning that's needed in daily living, such as wisdom, compassion, empathy, planning, decision making, and understanding right from wrong. So they have what they need to not start on drugs, and they have resource and agency and cognitive driven behavior where they can actually go out into the world and feel confident and have the esteem they need and the decision making capabilities to navigate in the world and be proud of their culture and come back with an education to their tribal nations and do something good and rebuild. So this is the hope. This is my mission, and I hope that you'll join me. We're starting to grow in scale, and working with the higher up organizations needed to bleed down into the lower ones. So thank you so much for being here with me today. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I look forward to seeing you in our next week's video. We're going to have Luis Baca, who is a Pueblo native, and he's going to be sharing with us about some of the issues that he sees and solutions that he's providing for his native people. So I look forward to seeing you next week.